My name is Jim, and I spend way too much time thinking about why the milestones we're told to celebrate often feel like a quiet closing of doors. It was a Saturday morning, maybe 6 months after I'd closed on the place. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking over my accounts. The lawn was mowed, the mortgage was set to autopay, and for the first time in years, the numbers were perfectly stable. There was no crisis, no bad debt, and nothing was broken. And then it hit me. That was the moment I realized buying the house didn't make me poorer. It just made my life smaller. Everything on that screen was correct, yet I felt a strange, new weight. I realized that while my income could still go up or down, my ability to change my life had become static. I call this financial range. It's the distance between what you must pay every month and the choices you're still allowed to make. When I bought the house, my income stayed flexible, but my choices didn't. Now look, this isn't an anti-house video. I'm not here to tell you to rent forever, but I am here to talk about the one thing the bank doesn't disclose in the closing documents. The specific way homeownership changes your behavior, narrows your career, and quietly kills your ability to take a risk. We're going to look at why that range disappears, when the trade-off is actually worth it, and why this safe investment is often the very thing that keeps people stuck in a life they've done, outgrown. Because the most expensive part of owning a home isn't the mortgage. It's the range you give up without ever realizing you had it. Section 1. Why the numbers stop moving. I want you to think back to the last time you felt a genuine sense of financial give. Maybe it was a year where you decided to work less and travel more. Or perhaps a month where you cut your spending to the bone because you wanted to invest in a friend's startup. You had what I call amplitude. Your financial life could expand or contract based on the rhythm of your actual life. But when you buy the house, the first thing you notice, if you're paying attention, is that the optional rows in your spreadsheet start to vanish. Before, your budget was a series of levers. You could pull the rent lever by moving to a smaller place. You could pull the lifestyle lever by changing zip codes. But the mortgage, that isn't a lever. It's a pillar. And once that pillar is driven into the ground, the rest of the structure has to be built around it. You might get a 10% raise at work, and usually that would feel like a surge of new possibilities. But now, that raise is immediately swallowed by the gravity of the house, the property tax hike you didn't see coming, or the realization that a 3-bedroom home requires 3 bedrooms worth of furniture. And then it hits you. The numbers have stopped moving. Your income might go up, but your financial range, the distance between what you must spend and what you can do, stays exactly the same. Nothing broke. The system just stopped bending. Section 2. Fixed costs versus adjustable lives. Here's the part nobody tells you about the security of a fixed-rate mortgage. We call it stability, but in reality, it's a form of structural deafness. When you rent or when you live a high-mobility life, your expenses are at least somewhat conversational. If life gets loud, if you lose a client or decide to switch careers, you can talk to your budget and make adjustments. But a house doesn't have ears. The house doesn't care if you've burnt out on your corporate job and want to spend 6 months painting in a garage. The house doesn't care if a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity opens up in a city 4 states away. The mortgage, the insurance premiums, the property taxes, and the relentless upkeep are costs that completely ignore your life circumstances. We're told that owning a home is locking in your future. And it is. But it's also locking in a version of you that existed the day you signed those papers. This is where things get uncomfortable. We spend our 20s and 30s growing, changing, and evolving our ambitions. But the house is static. It demands the same tribute every 30 days, regardless of whether you still want the life you're paying for. The house doesn't get cheaper when your ambition changes. It just becomes a heavier weight to carry while you're trying to pivot. Section 3. The real cost of security. We need to talk about what safety actually means. In the American script, safety is defined by the absence of change. You have a 30-year fixed mortgage. Therefore, you are safe from the whims of a landlord. But this is a very fragile definition of security. To me, true financial safety isn't about a fixed payment. It's about absorptive capacity. It's the ability of your life to take a punch and keep moving. Imagine you're hit with a sudden layoff, or even worse, a deep, soul-crushing burnout. If you're renting or living a high-flexibility life, you have gears you can shift. You can sublet, you can move into a studio, you can cut your overhead by 40% in 30 days. You have a shock absorber, but the moment you buy the house, your shock absorber is replaced by a rigid steel bar. When you lose your job, the house doesn't offer a burnout discount. In fact, that's usually when the water heater decides to give up. Here's the part nobody tells you. The homeowner is actually less safe in a crisis because their largest expense is the one they are least allowed to change. You've traded the ability to adjust for the illusion of standing still. We call it settling down, but sometimes it feels more like being pinned down. If a career pivot requires you to take a 20% pay cut to learn a new industry, the house might be the only thing standing in your way. The renter can pivot in a month. The homeowner has to sell, stage, pay commissions, and wait, all while the fixed costs continue to drain the tank. Section 4. When capital stops working for you. We're taught to look at our equity with a sense of pride. We see that number on a portal once a month and think, I'm building wealth. And while that's technically true on a balance sheet, there is a massive difference between wealth and utility. Think about the money you put into the house, the initial chunk, and the extra principal. When that money was sitting in a brokerage account or even a high-yield savings account, it was liquid capital. It was like having a fleet of small, fast boats ready to deploy the second an opportunity or a crisis appeared. It could react. The moment that money goes into the house, those boats are taken out of the water and welded into the foundation. This is what I mean by financial narrowing. We didn't necessarily lose the money, we just immobilized it. We've traded active capital for passive shelter, and then it hits you. You might be worth $500,000, but if you need 50,000 of it to start a business or cover a family emergency tomorrow, you have to ask the bank for permission to touch your own wealth. You have to pay interest to borrow back the money you worked to put in there. We didn't invest our money. We immobilized it. We've built a fortress, but we've used our exit strategy as the bricks. Section 5. Career consequences. No one models. We talk about the house as a financial asset, but we almost never talk about it as a behavioral leash. When your range narrows, your appetite for risk doesn't just diminish, it evaporates. Think about the last time you felt truly bold at work. Maybe you wanted to push back on a project that didn't align with your values. Or you were considering a move to a smaller, more volatile company with a massive upside. When you have low fixed costs, that's a calculation about your future. But once you have a mortgage, that's no longer a career decision. It's a survival decision. This is where things get uncomfortable. You don't stop taking risks because you've become mature. You stop taking risks because the consequences are no longer symmetrical. If a renter takes a career gamble and fails, they move to a smaller apartment. If a homeowner takes a gamble and fails, they risk a systemic collapse of their entire social identity. The house quietly turns no into your default answer. You stay in the job you've outgrown. You stop negotiating for that raise because you can't afford a week of friction. You stop looking at the horizon because you're too busy staring at the foundation. We think we're buying peace of mind, but often we're just buying a reason to stay quiet. Section 6. Why this worked for our parents and breaks now. Whenever I talk about this, someone always points to the previous generation. My parents bought a house in 1984, and it was the best thing they ever did. And then it hits you. They aren't wrong, but they were playing a completely different game. For our parents, the math of homeownership functioned in an era of the long climb. You had stable jobs, wages that generally outpaced inflation, and most importantly, the entry price of a home was a much smaller multiple of your annual income. In that world, a house was a forced savings account that didn't prevent you from living. Today, we are operating in a landscape of the great volatility. Careers are no longer ladders. They're jungle gyms. We change industries 3 times before we're 40. We live in an economy where the biggest wage gains come from moving across the country, not staying in the same cubicle for 30 years. When you apply 1980s advice to a 2026 economy, the machine breaks. Back then, the house was a tailwind. Today, with geographic wage gaps and astronomical entry costs, the house is often a headwind. Our parents bought a home as a sanctuary from a predictable world. We are being told to buy an asset that anchors us to an unpredictable one. Same advice, different economy. Section 7, renting as a deliberate strategy. We've been conditioned to view renting as throwing money away, or, at best, a temporary waiting room for real adulthood. But if we look at the world through the lens of financial range, renting starts to look like something else entirely. It's not a lack of commitment, it's a deliberate purchase of optionality. When you rent, you aren't just paying for a roof. You're paying for the ability to move for a 40% salary increase in 48 hours. You're paying for the power to negotiate with your current employer because you know your overhead is flexible. You're paying for speed. In a world that moves as fast as ours, speed is often more valuable than equity. But here is the part where I have to be intellectually honest with you. Renting only works as a strategy if you actually use the range it gives you. If you rent and simply spend the difference on a nicer car or more expensive dinners, you aren't buying freedom. You're just consuming. The strategy only holds if that immobilized capital, the money that would have been buried in a down payment, is being used with intention elsewhere. Whether that's in a liquid portfolio, a side business, or simply a massive cash cushion that allows you to say no to a toxic boss. Renting isn't a failure to settle down. It's a decision to stay light until the terrain is worth the wait. Section 8. When commitment actually makes sense. I don't want you to leave this thinking that I'm anti-home. I'm not. I'm anti-accident. I'm against people stumbling into the biggest financial commitment of their lives because a social script told them it was the smart move. The truth is, commitment is one of the most powerful tools in the world, but only when it actually matches your flood timeline. There is a version of homeownership that is beautiful. It happens when you've reached a stage of long-term certainty. You aren't buying the house because you think it's a great investment. You're buying it because you've decided that for the next 10 or 15 years, your range matters less than your roots. A home makes sense when you have the financial shock absorption to handle its deafness. When a broken HVAC system is an annoyance, not an existential crisis. When your career is in a low volatility phase, where you no longer need the agility to pivot every 18 months. At that point, the narrowing of your world isn't a trap. It's a choice. The goal isn't to avoid the house forever. The goal is to make sure that when you finally drive that pillar into the ground, you aren't pinning down a version of yourself that still needs to run. Section 9. The ultimate reframe. We've spent a lot of time dissecting why the numbers stop moving. But I want to leave you with the most important shift in perspective. We are taught to view a home as a wealth accelerator. We're told it's the engine that pulls the rest of your financial life forward. But after looking at the math and the psychological trade-offs for a long time, I've realized that's not quite right. A house is actually a commitment amplifier. It takes whatever stage of life you are currently in and it turns the volume up to 10. It locks it in. It makes it permanent. If you are in a career you love, in a city you adore, with a financial cushion that can handle a storm, the house amplifies that stability. It creates a sanctuary. But if you are still searching, still pivoting, or still building your foundation, the house doesn't fix those uncertainties. It amplifies them. It turns a temporary career hurdle into a high-stakes crisis. It turns a desire for change into a logistical nightmare. And then it hits you. You don't get the security of the house for free. You pay for it with your agility. We are obsessed with locking in a price, but we rarely talk about locking in a person. Before you optimize for permanence, you have to make sure you understand exactly what it's going to cost you in motion. Because in the modern economy, being able to move is often the most valuable asset you can own. If you're sitting at that kitchen table today, looking at your own spreadsheet and wondering why you feel so heavy despite doing everything right, Just know that you aren't imagining it. Your range has narrowed. And acknowledging that is the first step toward reclaiming it. Whether you decide to sign that 30-year contract or keep your bags packed for a while longer, just make sure you're the one holding the pen, not the script someone else wrote for you. 30 years ago.